My husband abandoned me for another woman and invited my entire family to his wedding abroad. He sent me a message saying, "Make sure you're gone before we return. You are too old to meet my taste." When they all came back, they discovered what I'd done. Their joy disappeared instantly. They stared at the empty land where our house should have been and exchanged panicked looks with each other. I simply watched from my neighbor's house across the street and smiled. The phone screen glowed in the darkness of my car, casting blue light across my trembling fingers as I stared at the text for 3 seconds. Just 3 seconds before my world reorganized itself into something unrecognizable. "Don't be home when we get back. Once it's old, it's dead to me." Below the message sat a photograph that stopped my breath. Mexico at sunset, champagne glasses raised. My husband's arm wrapped around a woman in white, while my entire family smiled in celebration behind them, their joy so genuine it felt like a physical wound. Across the street, metal screamed against concrete as the excavator's claw bit into the 5th floor of the Riverside building, ripping away what had stood for 60 years in a controlled demolition that sent dust billowing into the November air while the foreman studied his tablet, calculating each strike with surgical precision. Floor by floor, wall by wall, deliberate erasure unfolding before my eyes. I zoomed into the photograph until my mother's face filled the screen, and there she was wearing that lavender dress, the exact same shade she'd worn to my wedding 12 years ago. But this time, her smile reached her eyes with real joy, unrestrained and glowing with the kind of happiness she'd stopped showing me somewhere around year 7, right about when she started suggesting marriage counseling in that careful voice that meant she already knew the answer. My thumb moved to my sister June, who held a bouquet of white roses in her perfectly manicured hands, and the realization hit me like a physical blow. She'd been a bridesmaid at my husband's 2nd wedding, standing there in paradise celebrating my replacement while I sat home alone reviewing architectural blueprints. The excavator pulled back and repositioned itself with mechanical efficiency, and I watched the operator through his cab window, noting how he wore headphones and moved with unhurried confidence. Someone who'd done this hundreds of times and knew exactly where to strike, which walls were load-bearing, which could crumble first, because demolition wasn't destruction at all. It was choreography, a carefully planned performance of calculated erasure. My father stood rigid in the photo with his shoulders squared and jaw tight, and while his body language screamed discomfort, while his grip on the champagne flute looked white-knuckled and painful, he was there nonetheless, present and participating. And that presence was its own verdict, its own choice, its own betrayal. And Marcus, my baby brother, the one I'd carried through college when our parents' restaurant failed, the one whose rent I'd covered for 6 months, whose resume I'd polished, who'd called me his hero at graduation with his voice breaking from gratitude, now stood in paradise grinning at my replacement with champagne raised in toast to my deletion, as if those years of sacrifice meant absolutely nothing. I pressed my forehead against the steering wheel and waited for tears that refused to come, but instead, there was only the sound of demolition across the street and a strange, crystalline clarity forming in my mind like ice spreading across a windshield, cold and sharp and absolutely unforgiving. The phone buzzed with another notification, and when I looked down, I saw that Michael had made the photo public on Instagram, posting it for the world to see with a caption that made my stomach turn. "Starting our forever in paradise, surrounded by the people who matter most." The people who matter most. As if I'd never mattered at all. As if 12 years could be erased as easily as deleting a photograph. As if I was something old and dead that could simply be discarded without consequence. My fingers moved across the phone screen with surprising steadiness as I typed words I knew would deceive perfectly. Words that would make him believe I was the same accommodating woman I'd always been. "Enjoy Mexico. I'll make sure everything's handled. Send." Michael would read that text while sitting on a beach with her, his champagne glass sweating in the tropical heat, and he'd smile with satisfaction and probably show it to Chastity, saying something like, "See? I told you she'd understand. She always understands. She never makes waves, because that's exactly who I'd trained myself to be over 12 years, the understanding wife, the flexible partner, the woman who accommodated and adjusted and never quite asked the right questions, who made excuses for every absence and rationalized every lie." But accommodation ends the moment you see your entire family celebrating your replacement. The moment you realize that everyone you trusted has chosen someone else's happiness over your devastation. The moment clarity replaces denial, and you finally see the truth you've been avoiding for years. I scrolled through my contacts with my thumb hovering over a name I'd kept deliberately close, despite Michael's objections over the years. Lisa Smith, attorney. The woman who'd structured my LLC when I launched my architecture firm. The woman who'd pushed, almost insisted, that Michael sign a postnuptial agreement 5 years ago when my business expanded. The woman whose instincts I should have trusted more completely. Michael had called the postnup paranoid and insulting, had complained for weeks about how I didn't trust him, didn't believe in our partnership, was being unnecessarily cautious, and treating our marriage like a business transaction, instead of a union built on love. Now I understood with perfect clarity that my instinct had been watching my marriage crumble in real time while my conscious mind built blueprints and pretended everything was stable, while I poured 80-hour weeks into designing buildings that would last forever even as my personal foundation was being systematically undermined. The phone rang twice before Lisa's voice cut through, sharp and immediate, already knowing something catastrophic had happened before I said a single word. "Monica, what happened?" Not a question, but a statement, delivered with the confidence of someone who'd seen this scenario play out countless times, who knew that late-night calls from married clients only meant one thing. "How fast can we move?" My voice sounded strange to my own ears, flat and mechanical, emptied of everything except calculation and cold determination. Silence stretched between us for a long moment, and I could picture Lisa in her downtown office, already pulling up files despite the late hour, her brilliant legal mind racing through strategies and timelines and tactical possibilities. "How fast do you need?" I calculated the timeline with mathematical precision, factoring in flight schedules and customs processing, and the drive from Logan Airport to our neighborhood. "They land in 9 days. Lisa's laugh was low and predatory, the sound of someone who'd spent 20 years destroying unfaithful spouses in mahogany courtrooms, while billing $600 an hour and never losing a single case. "Then we'll build you a beautiful new life in 8. Sleep never came that night, so instead I sat at my kitchen table. The kitchen where Michael and I had cooked Sunday dinners in our first year when we still believed in forever, and started building lists with the same methodical precision I applied to architectural projects, treating my marriage's dissolution like a construction plan that required careful documentation of every structural element. Assets, properties, accounts, everything we owned together and everything I owned alone spread across 17 pages in my precise handwriting. The house inherited from my grandmother and kept in my name despite Michael's repeated protests. The cars registered as company vehicles under my business. The Vermont condo we'd visited twice before deciding weekend getaways felt like obligations rather than pleasures. Bank accounts where my firm's substantial profits sat alongside his modest sales commissions that never quite seemed to match his alleged workload. By 3 in the morning, those 17 pages of notes had transformed into something more dangerous than documentation. They'd become a blueprint for systematic deconstruction, a plan for controlled demolition that would leave nothing standing when I was finished. By dawn, as weak November light filtered through the kitchen windows, I had mapped out every move with architectural precision, understanding exactly which structural supports to remove to make the entire edifice of our shared life collapse in on itself. The black suit felt like armor when I put it on at 5:30 in the morning, the expensive Armani I wore for presentations to corporate clients who controlled 8-figure budgets, the one that made me feel competent and untouchable and dangerous, like I could walk into any room and command it through sheer force of professional competence. Lisa texted at precisely 6 o'clock, "I'm here, come now." Her office occupied the 14th floor of a glass tower overlooking Boston Harbor, and when I arrived, 2 coffee cups waited on her desk while floor-to-ceiling windows framed the water like expensive artwork. Everything about the space screaming success without apologizing for a single dollar of it. Lisa didn't offer sympathy or ask if I was okay, or waste time with the performative kindness people give to wounded things. She simply slid a manila folder across the polished wood, and stated with absolute confidence, "Filed at 7 this morning." I opened it with hands that had stopped trembling, and the paperwork felt heavy and formal and brutal in its precision. Divorce petition, with grounds listed as abandonment, adultery, and breach of postnuptial agreement, each word chosen for maximum legal impact. We have evidence. Lisa pulled out her tablet and began swiping through images with the efficiency of someone presenting architectural renderings, each swipe revealing another transaction that told the story I'd been too busy designing buildings to read properly. Credit card statements stretched across 18 months, showing hotels I'd never stayed in, restaurants I'd never visited, jewelry purchases that never appeared on my finger, each charge representing another lie I'd accepted, another absence I'd rationalized, another evening I'd spent alone while he built a separate life with someone else. There's more. Lisa's voice sharpened and took on the edge she used before destroying someone professionally, and she turned the tablet toward me, showing an audio file with a timestamp from 6 weeks ago. Listen. She pressed play, and Michael's voice filled the office, tinny through the speakers but absolutely unmistakable in its casual cruelty. Don't worry, babe. Once I get the money from the house, we can leave sooner. She'll never know until it's too late. Chassidy's laugh came next, light and carefree, the sound of someone who had no idea she was being recorded, no concept of consequences waiting in her future. You're terrible, but I love it. I love you. Michael's voice again, warmer than I'd heard it in years, filled with genuine affection he'd stopped showing me long ago. This time next year, we'll be in our place in Miami. She'll still be in that office working herself to death, and we'll be living our actual lives. Lisa stopped the recording and watched my face carefully, probably expecting tears or rage or some kind of emotional breakdown, but I just stared at the tablet waiting for pain that refused to arrive, wondering distantly why those words didn't shatter something inside me the way they should have. The words should have destroyed me, should have made me scream and weep and collapse. But instead there was only this spreading coldness, this absolute clarity, this recognition that I'd been building a future for someone who'd already moved into a different structure entirely, someone who'd never intended to stay, who'd been planning his exit for years while I poured everything into a marriage he'd already abandoned emotionally. He'll be served tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. in his office, Lisa said with a smile that looked surgical in its precision. Process server will hand-deliver in front of his colleagues, including Chassity, so everyone will know simultaneously what kind of man they've been working with. Lisa's office grew darker as afternoon collapsed into evening, but neither of us moved to turn on the lights, and her assistant Rebecca pulled up spreadsheets that glowed against the encroaching shadows while 3 hours disappeared into the dissection of my marriage. Everything reduced to numbers that told a story I'd been too blind to read while living it. The joint checking account appeared first on the screen with 12 years of deposits stretched across the digital ledger, like evidence at a crime scene. And what I saw made my breath catch in my throat. My contributions totaled $860,000 over 12 years of marriage, representing countless 80-hour weeks and successful projects and buildings that would define Boston's skyline. Michael's contributions totaled $4,500, an amount so shockingly small, I had to read it 3 times to believe it was real. $4,500 over 12 years worked out to $375 per year, $31 per month, less than $1 per day, an amount so negligible it barely qualified as participation. More like a token gesture than actual contribution to our shared life. Where did his salary go? My voice sounded hollow as I asked the question, already suspecting the answer but needing to hear it confirmed. Lisa's fingers moved across her keyboard, with the precision of a surgeon making an incision, and she pulled up another account I'd forgotten existed. You're still listed as secondary on his personal account. He opened it when you first married and never removed your access. Probably never imagined you'd actually look. The screen shifted to reveal Michael's private financial life laid bare in transaction after transaction, each one a small detonation that reconfigured my understanding of reality. Restaurants I'd never visited, hotels in cities where he claimed he was attending sales conferences, a recurring charge to a jewelry boutique in Cambridge, representing monthly purchases I'd never received, and something else that made my stomach turn, a storage unit with monthly payments stretching back 26 months to a facility I'd never heard him mention once. He's been constructing a separate existence for at least 2 years, possibly longer, Lisa said in a voice that remained clinical and detached, despite the magnitude of betrayal she was revealing. This storage unit is where people hide things they don't want their spouses to find. Furniture for future homes, documents they're keeping secret, evidence of other betrayals. Lisa pulled up property records before I could ask about the storage unit's contents. And what appeared on screen made my hands go cold, despite the office's carefully maintained temperature. The house is titled exclusively to your LLC, she stated flatly, her tone carrying the weight of courtroom verdicts. You purchased it 3 years before the marriage as a business investment, and Michael never contributed to mortgage payments, property taxes, insurance premiums, or renovation costs. Legally, he has zero claim to any equity whatsoever. She continued clicking through documents with methodical efficiency. The cars were both registered as company vehicles under my business. The Vermont condo had been purchased entirely through my LLC, and every asset I'd assumed we owned together was actually mine alone, protected by corporate structures I'd established years ago. He owns nothing, Lisa stated with absolute finality. According to the postnuptial agreement he signed without reading, any property purchased or maintained during the marriage, using your business income, remains exclusively yours, and he relinquished all claims to marital assets beyond what he directly contributed. The irony settled over me like ash from a burned building. All those years I'd worked 80-hour weeks building my architecture firm and designing buildings that would last generations. I'd been simultaneously building a financial fortress that protected me from the very man I thought I was building a future with, my subconscious somehow understanding what my conscious mind refused to acknowledge. So the $4,500 is all he's legally entitled to? Precisely. Then let's liquidate the joint accounts immediately and transfer every dollar I deposited to a new account, in my name alone. I paused for just a moment, calculating the perfect response. Leave him exactly $4,500, because fair is fair, and he should get exactly what he contributed. Nothing more, nothing less. Lisa's smile was predatory and sharp enough to draw blood. The drive home felt longer than usual, as though the city had expanded while I'd been in Lisa's office learning the mathematics of my own destruction, and when I pulled into the driveway, the house looked the same, colonial architecture with mature trees and perfectly maintained lawn. But I knew I was seeing it differently now, not as our home but as my property, my investment, my structure that Michael had simply inhabited like a tenant who'd forgotten to pay rent for 12 years. Inside, the silence felt oppressive as I walked through rooms that suddenly felt like crime scenes, each space holding evidence of a marriage that had been nothing but performance. The living room furniture I'd selected from boutique shops while Michael scrolled through his phone, claiming he trusted my judgment. The kitchen appliances I'd researched for weeks before installing them myself, because Michael was always too busy with work. Artwork lining walls that I'd discovered in galleries I'd visited alone because Michael's emergencies always prevented him from joining me. His side of the closet stood abandoned from his Mexico packing winter coats hanging on hangers I'd bought, work clothes arranged by color, shoes lined up on the rack I'd given him 3 Christmases ago when he'd complained about his old one breaking. He'd assumed he'd return to all of this, assumed I'd still be here waiting and accepting and understanding, assumed this house would serve as his safety net while he tested the waters of his new existence with chastity. I began packing his belongings with surgical detachment, no emotion and no hesitation, just methodical removal of every trace. Clothes went into donation bags. His vintage movie poster collection got carefully rolled and stored in tubes. Personal items disappeared into cardboard boxes that would soon disappear into donation centers across Boston. That's when I found the folder hidden in the back of his filing cabinet, tucked behind tax returns from 6 years ago. Manila, and unlabeled and deliberately concealed. Inside were loan applications, 4 of them, all denied, all dated 6 months ago, and as I read through each one, my disbelief crystallized into fury so cold it felt like ice spreading through my veins. Applications for a second mortgage on the house, my house, the property owned exclusively by my LLC, and Michael had listed himself as sole owner, had forged my signature on initial documentation, had claimed the property was jointly owned, and that I'd verbally agreed to the loan. The applications had been rejected because title searches revealed the truth. But he'd tried nonetheless, had actively attempted to steal equity from my property to fund his escape with Chastity, had been willing to commit fraud to access money that had never been his. There was more in the folder, printed emails between Michael and Chastity, with timestamps showing they'd been planning this far longer than I'd imagined, and reading them felt like watching a building collapse in slow motion, each message revealing another structural failure I'd missed. Michael, the loan got denied again. Her name is on everything. I don't know how to get around it. Chastity. Can't you just forge her signature on a sale agreement? Michael. Too risky. Title companies verify everything. But don't worry, babe. Once I get the money somehow, we can leave sooner. She'll never know until it's too late. She's always been too trusting, too understanding. It makes things easier. I photographed every page with trembling hands and sent them to Lisa, who called back within 2 minutes with professional excitement vibrating in her voice. Monica, this is fraud, attempted fraud at minimum, but we can make a case for conspiracy given Chastity's participation, she said rapidly. He forged your signature on legal documents, which constitutes multiple felonies that completely change our case strategy. Add it to the divorce filing, I said coldly. Add it to everything. I began researching demolition companies in the Boston area that night, and if they wanted me gone when they returned from paradise, I'd make absolutely certain there was nothing left for them to return to. Nothing but empty space where our life used to stand. Westwood Demo and Excavation appeared at the top of the search results, with 5-star ratings and professional testimonials, though their waiting list stretched 3 months into the future, which meant they were good at what they did, but also meant I'd need to be persuasive. I called anyway, and a man answered on the 4th ring with exhaustion heavy in his voice. Westwood Demo, we're booked solid through January, but if you want to leave your information, I need a house demolished in 5 days with full teardown and debris removal, and I'll pay double your standard rate. Silence stretched between us for several long seconds, and I could hear him breathing and recalculating, weighing the money against the impossibility. Ma'am, permitting a loan takes 4 to 6 weeks minimum. We can't just show up and start swinging without proper documentation and city approval. I'll have the permits by tomorrow afternoon. Another pause, this one longer, and I heard papers shuffling on his end. What's the address? I gave it to him and heard typing, the click of keys like a countdown to something irreversible. That's a historic property according to these listing photos. Beautiful 1920s colonial with original details. You sure you want to tear it down? Positive. More typing, more silence, more calculation. Let me talk to Jack. He's our senior foreman. He'll call you back within the hour if he thinks we can make this work. Jack Morrison's call came exactly 43 minutes later, and his voice carried the rough texture of someone who'd spent decades shouting over machinery and breathing dust, and watching buildings fall according to plan. My guy says you want a demo in 5 days with permits handled by tomorrow. And lady, that's not how this works in the real world. There are processes and regulations and about 15 different departments that need to sign off. It is if you want the job and double your standard rate plus a bonus for expedited scheduling. He laughed, but not with amusement, more with surprise and intrigue, like someone had just proposed an impossible challenge he suddenly wanted to solve. I've been doing this for 30 years. And nobody gets permits that fast, not even developers with city council connections and lobbyists on speed dial. I'm an architect who's designed half the commercial buildings currently rising in Boston, and I know every planning commissioner by name, know which ones owe me favors, know exactly how to navigate the system when speed is essential. My doorbell rang suddenly, cutting through the conversation, and I froze with the phone pressed to my ear while staring at the front door, because it was 9:47 at night. And nobody visited at this hour unless they were delivering news you didn't want to hear. Hold on, I said to Jack, and walked toward the door with my heart starting to pound. Through the frosted glass I could see a silhouette, tall with broad shoulders, wrong proportions to be Mrs. Kowalski or any of my neighbors. I opened the door to find a man I'd never seen before, holding an envelope that looked too official to contain anything good. Monica Thompson? Yes. He handed me the envelope without ceremony. You've been served. Then he was gone, walking back to a car I hadn't noticed parked at the curb, leaving me standing in the doorway, holding papers I hadn't expected while Jack Morrison's voice continued speaking from my phone, and the house that was about to become rubble waited behind me in the darkness. Inside the envelope, I could see the letterhead, even without opening it fully. Michael's attorney, which meant he'd filed first, which meant he thought he could control the narrative and the outcome, which meant he had absolutely no idea what was coming for him. The permits will be ready by 2 p.m. tomorrow, I told Jack once I'd collected myself, and returned to the phone conversation, my voice steady despite the served papers sitting on my kitchen counter like an accusation. Silence filled the phone line, stretching so long I thought the connection had dropped. Then Jack Morrison's rough voice returned, carrying a note I couldn't quite identify. Respect, maybe, or concern, or some combination that suggested he understood this was about more than real estate development. Why the rush? He asked finally, and the question came without judgment, just genuine curiosity about what would drive someone to demolish a historic property in less than a week. I could have constructed a lie about buyers waiting or development plans requiring immediate demolition, could have hidden behind professional language and business necessity, but something about Jack's directness made me answer with brutal honesty. My husband married someone else last week while I was home working on blueprints, had his wedding in Mexico, and took my entire family with him to celebrate while I sat here alone, I said, hearing my voice remain steady despite the magnitude of betrayal I was describing. Now they're all coming back, expecting everything to be exactly as they left it, expecting me to be gone and compliant and erased. The silence that followed felt different than before, heavier and more meaningful, and I could almost hear Jack recalculating and reassessing and understanding something that went far beyond permits and demolition schedules. What time tomorrow works for you? He asked finally, his tone shifting to something more determined. 10 a.m., if that's possible. I'll be there. We met at the house the next morning with November cold biting through my jacket, and Jack arrived in a pickup truck that looked like it had survived multiple decades and several wars, with paint faded to an indeterminate color, somewhere between gray and brown and rust blooming along the wheel wells. Though the engine sounded solid and dependable, when he climbed out wearing work boots caked with old concrete and a flannel shirt covered in so many paint stains, it resembled abstract art. He walked the property with the careful attention of someone reading a book in a foreign language, trying to understand the story hidden beneath the surface, while his boots left impressions in the lawn I'd spent years maintaining with careful weekend labor. He studied the foundation, checking for cracks and testing stability, examined the roofline looking for structural weaknesses, ran his hands along exterior walls feeling for damage I couldn't see, and every few minutes he'd stop to take photos with a camera that looked older than my marriage and make notes on a clipboard that had clearly survived multiple construction sites. Finally, he turned to me with an expression that suggested he'd finished his assessment. Solid structure with great bones. You could renovate this and flip it for $3 million, maybe more given the neighborhood and the historic details that buyers pay premium prices for. I don't want to renovate it. Jack looked at me then. Really looked. Not the way men in business meetings looked while assessing competence and calculating worth, but with genuine attempt to understand something that violated logic, something that required emotional mathematics he couldn't quite solve. You know, once it's gone permanently. No getting it back. No changing your mind next week when the anger fades and you start second-guessing this decision, he said carefully, giving me one last chance to reconsider. This is irreversible. I know, and I'm absolutely certain. He nodded slowly and wrote something on his clipboard. With expedited permits, we can start tomorrow morning. Demo takes about 8 hours for a house this size. If we work carefully to control dust and minimize disruption to neighbors, then debris removal takes another full day, so you'll have an empty lot by Friday evening. How much? $47,000, including the rush job premium and weekend crew rates. I didn't hesitate or pause to consider if this was rational or justified. Done. Jack extended his hand with a grip that was firm and calloused. The handshake of someone who'd built and destroyed more structures than I designed in my entire career. I'll need those permits by 2, like you said. You'll have them. I spent the rest of that day making calls, and using every professional favor I'd accumulated over 15 years in Boston's architecture community, calling planning commissioners who'd fast-tracked my zoning appeals, building inspectors who'd expedited my project approvals, city officials I'd helped with pro bono designs for public spaces they couldn't afford to hire established firms for. Each call followed the same pattern. I explained what I needed with professional efficiency. They asked why the rush with varying levels of curiosity. I gave vague explanations about structural concerns and development opportunities that weren't technically lies, and they agreed because I'd earned their trust and respect through years of quality work and professional integrity. By 1:30 in the afternoon, I had every signature I needed. By 2 o'clock, Jack had the permits in his weathered hands, and by 2:15, he was looking at the paperwork like it might be counterfeit. "I'll be damned," he said with genuine admiration in his voice. "You actually did it, got full demolition permits in under 24 hours. Which shouldn't be possible according to everything I know about city bureaucracy. I told you I would." He folded the permits carefully and tucked them in his truck's glove compartment. "We start at 6 a.m. tomorrow. You want to be here to watch? Wouldn't miss it." After Jack left, I returned to the house for one final task, clearing Michael's home office, because most of his belongings were already boxed and staged in the garage waiting for Goodwill's Friday pickup. But his filing cabinet remained untouched like a metallic monolith in the corner that I'd been avoiding, without fully understanding why. The bottom drawer held that folder I'd found earlier, and as I pulled it out again to photograph the remaining pages, something else caught my eye. A second folder tucked even further back, hidden behind tax returns and old insurance policies, deliberately concealed where I'd never think to look. Inside were more loan applications I hadn't seen before. These ones dating back almost 2 years, showing Michael had been trying to access my assets far longer than I'd realized, trying different banks and different strategies, getting rejected over and over but never giving up, never stopping his systematic attempts to steal from me. There were also printed emails between Michael and Chastity, with timestamps showing they'd been planning this for at least 3 years, not the 18 months I'd initially calculated, which meant Michael had started his affair and his exit strategy almost immediately after I'd won the contract for the Meridian Tower, almost immediately after my career had reached a level of success that made me valuable enough to exploit. I photographed everything with hands that had stopped shaking hours ago, sent the new evidence to Lisa, who called back within minutes sounding almost gleeful. "Monica, this establishes a pattern of predatory behavior spanning years. We can show systematic financial manipulation, show he targeted you specifically because of your assets and earning potential. Show this wasn't just an affair but an extended con game," she said rapidly. "This strengthens our case exponentially and opens up additional legal avenues we hadn't considered." "Good," I said simply. "Use all of it." Day 6. Demolition. The Westwood crew arrived at dawn with 3 trucks and 6 workers unloading equipment with practiced efficiency that spoke of hundreds of previous demolitions, moving like dancers who'd rehearsed this particular performance countless times until every motion became muscle memory. Jack saw me sitting in my car across the street and walked over with a coffee cup in hand and concern in his weathered face. "Last chance. Once we start, there's no stopping it, no pause button, no undo function because the house comes down and that's the end of it forever." I looked at the structure one final time, studying windows I'd chosen from catalogs during happier years, the door I'd painted robin's egg blue because it made me smile, the porch where I'd sat countless evenings waiting for Michael to come home from work, that was actually time spent with her, and I felt absolutely nothing except cold determination. "Start," I said without hesitation. The machinery roared to life with a sound that made Mrs. Kowalski appear on her porch in a bathrobe, with eyes wide with shock. And other neighbors emerged like prairie dogs sensing danger. Mr. Peterson, the Donaldsons, the retired couple from the corner who always waved but never spoke. Mrs. Kowalski rushed over with her bathrobe flapping in the November wind. "Monica, what's happening?" I smiled and took a sip of cold coffee. "Renovation with full demo, starting completely fresh. But where will you live?" "I've made arrangements." The wrecking ball swung in a perfect arc and connected with the east wall, the wall where Michael had hung his vintage movie posters, The collection he'd claimed was worth thousands, and the impact was deafening and visceral and violent in its finality, making the wall crumble in a cloud of dust that billowed into the cold morning air. By noon, the house was rubble and broken timber. By 3 o'clock, the second floor had been reduced to debris scattered across the lot, and by sunset, nothing remained but piles of wreckage waiting to be hauled away like the remains of a life I no longer recognized as mine. Jack approached as the crew packed their equipment, wiping his hands on his jeans and leaving dark streaks on the faded denim. "You okay?" I felt empty and lighter and free and terrified all simultaneously, like I'd jumped from a building and was still waiting to discover if I'd land safely or shatter on impact. "Yeah," I said finally, "I think I am." Debris removal trucks arrived at dawn, with the rumble of diesel engines echoing through the quiet neighborhood, and front-end loaders scooped up chunks of what used to be walls and floors and ceilings, each load carrying another piece of 12 years to landfills and recycling centers across the greater Boston area. The kitchen island got loaded onto a truck, the marble countertops I'd chosen from a supplier in Cambridge after weeks of research, the custom cabinets I'd designed myself to maximize storage, and I remembered we'd eaten our first meal in this house at that island, takeout Chinese, because we were too exhausted from moving to cook, and Michael had toasted with a beer bottle saying to our future, with what seemed like genuine warmth, though I wondered now if he'd already been planning his exit, or if that betrayal came later. The mantle went next, the one where I'd hung our wedding photo for 6 years before taking it down and telling myself it needed reframing, when the truth was, I couldn't look at his smile anymore without wondering if any of it had been real. The deck we'd built 3 summers ago got broken into pieces and hauled away by 11 in the morning, and I stood there remembering how we were supposed to grow old together on that deck, drinking coffee and watching sunsets, and sharing the comfortable silence of 2 people who'd built a life together, except he'd been building something else entirely with someone else the whole time. By afternoon, the lot was nearly clear with just dirt and scattered debris remaining, and the crew brought in a grader to level everything, until no evidence remained that a $2 million home had existed here just yesterday, until the land looked pristine and empty and ready for something new. My phone rang as the final truck pulled away, and June's name flashed across the screen with its cheerful contact photo from years ago when we'd still been close. "Monica, we're having the best time." Her voice was bright and cheerful and completely oblivious to the devastation she'd participated in. "Mexico is gorgeous. The beaches are incredible, the food is amazing, and the wedding was just perfect. You should have." "I got Michael's text," I interrupted, my voice colder than I intended. Silence stretched for several long seconds before she responded. "Oh, that." Her tone shifted immediately from bright to defensive, from cheerful to guilty, from sisterly to something that sounded almost hostile. "Look, we didn't want to get involved in your marriage problems because that's between you two, but Michael said you'd been over for a while, said you knew about Chastity, said you'd both agreed to separate and that this was mutual and amicable." "I agreed to nothing," I said, and each word came out sharp enough to cut. "He's lying to you, and you already know that deep down, don't you?" June sighed with that exasperated sound she always made when she thought I was being difficult or unreasonable or emotional, when I should be logical and accommodating. "You always do this, Monica. Always assume everyone's against you, always making yourself the victim when really you're just refusing to accept that people's needs change and relationships end," she said with the kind of casual cruelty that comes from years of resentment finally finding an outlet. "Michael loves you, but he needs something different now. Needs someone who makes him happy instead of someone who's always working and never has time for actual partnership." The words landed like a physical blow that knocked the air from my lungs and made my vision narrow. And I realized in that moment that this wasn't just about Michael's betrayal. My entire family had been complicit, had chosen his narrative over my reality, had decided I was disposable. "Someone who makes him happy?" I repeated slowly, tasting each word like poison. "I made him happy for 12 years, June. Put you through college when Mom and Dad couldn't afford it. Helped them with house payments when Dad lost his job. Held this family together financially while all of you—" "We have to go." She cut me off abruptly. The reception's starting and we can't miss the toasts. We'll talk when we get back, okay? The line went dead before I could respond, leaving me standing in an empty lot surrounded by nothing and holding a phone that suddenly felt impossibly heavy. My phone buzzed again within seconds, and my mother's text appeared with its characteristic mixture of passive aggression and maternal authority. "Hope you're well. We're having a wonderful time. You really should learn to be more flexible about these things. Life is too short to hold grudges." I read it 3 times, and each reading made it feel more surreal, more disconnected from reality, more evidence that my family existed in some alternate universe, where my pain was unreasonable, and my husband's betrayal was somehow my fault for not being accommodating enough. Another text appeared from Marcus, my baby brother, the one I'd put through college by covering his tuition for 4 years. "Michael says you're being difficult about the divorce. Can't you just let him be happy? You're always so controlling." I stood in the empty lot surrounded by nothing but leveled dirt and distant construction sounds, reading texts from my family that told me I was the problem, that my pain was unreasonable, that my refusal to gracefully accept betrayal made me the villain in a story where I should have been the victim. Day 8. I met Tom Brennan at a coffee shop in Cambridge, halfway between his office and mine, in the kind of place with exposed brick walls and overpriced lattes that Michael always complained about, calling them pretentious and wasteful whenever I suggested meeting clients there. Tom was already there when I arrived, occupying a corner table with a leather portfolio and reading glasses perched on his nose, and when he saw me, he stood immediately and extended his hand with a grip that was firm and honest and grounding. We sat across from each other, while he opened the portfolio with practiced efficiency and pulled out deed transfer documents flagged with yellow tabs indicating signature lines. And for a moment we just looked at each other in the kind of silence that precedes irreversible decisions. "This is prime property with excellent zoning and endless development potential," he said, reviewing the papers one more time despite having clearly examined them thoroughly already. "I'm still surprised you're selling, because land like this doesn't become available often. Most people hold on to property in this neighborhood forever and pass it down through generations." I wrapped my hands around my coffee cup and felt the ceramic heat against my palms, using the physical sensation to ground myself in the present moment. Time for a complete change. Tom nodded without pushing for elaboration, and he signed where his attorney had indicated before sliding the documents across the scarred wooden table for my signatures. I signed my name on 6 different pages with deliberate precision, and just like that, $3.2 million transferred into my business account, while the lot where my house used to stand, the land my grandmother left me in her will, the property Michael tried repeatedly to steal, became someone else's problem and someone else's opportunity. Tom gathered his papers and stood to leave, but he paused with his hand on the back of his chair, and his expression shifted into something closer to genuine concern. "I hope whatever you're starting fresh from, whatever you're leaving behind with this sale, I hope it's worth it, and I hope you find what you're looking for." "Thank you," I said quietly. "I think I already have." The reckoning. At exactly 2:35 in the afternoon, their flight landed at Logan Airport, according to the tracking app I'd been refreshing obsessively, and I sat in my car parked strategically across the street from where the house used to stand, watching the clock and calculating timelines with architectural precision. The lot looked absolutely perfect. Fresh sod laid with professional precision, green and uniform and undisturbed, with a small decorative bench I'd had installed yesterday positioned near the sidewalk in a touch I couldn't resist, because it made the empty lot look intentional and purposeful, like it had always been this way, like nothing substantial had ever existed in this space. I was wearing my power suit, the black Armani that fit like a second skin, with red bottom heels that added 3 inches to my height and made distinctive sounds on pavement, the auditory signature of someone who'd arrived and demanded attention, and I held a cup of coffee from the same shop where I'd met Tom Brennan, creating patterns and building rituals and marking territory in ways that felt both calculated and instinctive. At 3:58, 3 luxury SUVs turned onto the street in a convoy that screamed expense and celebration, Michael's Range Rover in the lead, followed by my father's sedan and June's hybrid, all of them fresh from paradise and completely unprepared for what waited. They pulled up to the curb where the driveway used to be and cut their engines simultaneously, and for a brief moment everything was silent, except for car doors opening and the sound of happy voices discussing the flight and the food and the memories they'd made while celebrating the end of my marriage. Michael emerged first from the middle vehicle, looking sun-tanned and relaxed in a linen shirt that probably cost more than his monthly contribution to our marriage, and he stretched with the casual confidence of someone who believed everything was going according to plan. Chastity stepped out next with her blonde hair in perfect waves and her white sundress catching the afternoon light, and the massive ring on her left hand threw light like a weapon every time she moved, broadcasting her new status to the world. My mother emerged from the lead SUV, wearing designer sunglasses and a lavender scarf, the same shade she'd worn in the wedding photo, the same shade she'd worn to my wedding, apparently her signature color for significant marital events, whether they were beginnings or endings. My father followed looking tired and confused, even before seeing the lot, something in his posture suggesting he knew on some unconscious level that catastrophe waited just around the corner. June emerged already scrolling through her phone and documenting her return for social media consumption, while Marcus started unloading luggage in a scene of domestic normalcy that was about to shatter completely. They were all smiling and laughing and talking over each other about flights and food and tropical adventures, performing happiness for an audience of neighbors and each other, broadcasting joy with complete confidence that everything would be exactly as they'd left it, until Michael turned toward where the house should be standing. His body went absolutely rigid, as though someone had pressed a pause button on his entire existence, and the smile disappeared from his face like it had been physically removed, and he took 2 stumbling steps toward the lot before stopping completely, just freezing in place, while his brain struggled to process what his eyes were seeing, or more accurately, what they weren't seeing. "Babe." Chastity's voice still held remnants of her smile as she clutched a shopping bag and looked at him with concern. "What's wrong?" Michael didn't answer because he couldn't form words, couldn't process the impossibility before him, couldn't reconcile the empty space with his expectations and memories. Chastity followed his gaze, and her smile faded incrementally as confusion replaced joy, and the shopping bag slipped from her fingers and hit the sidewalk with a soft thud that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. "Where's—" She started and stopped and started again. "Where's the house?" My mother's voice cut through the confusion like a blade sharpened specifically for this moment. "Marvin!" She grabbed my father's arm with desperation in her grip. "Marvin, where is it? Where's the house?" My father turned slowly, and his face went pale, actually drained of color like someone had pulled a plug and let all the blood drain out, and he made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a moan. June's phone clattered to the sidewalk and Marcus dropped 2 suitcases simultaneously, and for one perfect, crystalline moment, nobody moved or spoke, or even seemed to breathe. They just stood there on the sidewalk surrounded by luggage and shopping bags and the debris of their vacation, staring at pristine green grass and empty space where a $2 million home had stood 9 days ago. Michael spun in a complete circle looking at neighboring houses, Mrs. Kowalski's place to the left and the Petersons to the right, both exactly where they'd always been, and he looked at the mailbox still standing at the curb with the numbers clearly visible, confirming he had the right address and the correct location. "What?" His voice came out strangled and broken. "What the— where?" That's when Tom Brennan's truck pulled up in timing so perfect it felt choreographed, and he'd been driving past and saw the commotion and pulled over with the good instincts of someone who'd spent decades on construction sites where things could go wrong quickly. Tom got out of his truck and approached cautiously while reading the situation with professional assessment. "Can I help you folks?" Michael charged him with the sudden aggression of someone whose reality had just collapsed, actually charged like a bull seeing red. "What did you do to my house?" He was shouting now with veins bulging in his neck and face turning red. "Who are you? What did you do?" Tom held up his hands in a gesture of peace, while genuine confusion crossed his features. "Whoa, buddy. I don't know what you're talking about. My house." Michael pointed at the lot with a shaking hand. "There was a house here. My house. Where is it?" Tom glanced at the lot and then back at Michael with confusion deepening across his weathered face. I just bought this property yesterday in a legal sale with clean title. It's been an empty lot, and I don't know what. Empty? Michael's voice cracked with hysteria. It wasn't empty. There was a house. A $2 million house. My home? Tom pulled out his phone and showed the listing photos of the beautiful empty lot with fresh sod and development potential. See? This is what I bought. You must have the wrong address or something. My mother had started hyperventilating with her hand pressed against her chest. June was on her knees, picking up her phone with hands that shook so badly she dropped it twice. And Marcus just stood frozen with his mouth hanging open. That's when my mother saw me sitting in my car across the street, with the window rolled down and my elbow resting on the frame. Monica! She shrieked it not like a name but like an accusation, like a curse. What did you do? Everyone turned simultaneously, and I took a slow, deliberate sip of coffee before setting the cup down with exaggerated care, opening my car door, and stepping out onto the pavement with my heels making those distinctive clicking sounds that announced control and confidence. I walked toward them slowly with measured steps that weren't rushing and weren't hesitating, maintaining perfect composure while closing the distance until I stood exactly 6 feet away. Close enough to see their faces clearly but far enough to stay safe if things became physical. Hey everyone, I said with pleasant casualness, as if greeting them at a neighborhood barbecue. How was Mexico? Beautiful, I hope. Did you get my text about handling everything? Michael stared at me with his face cycling through expressions too fast to track individually. Confusion and disbelief and dawning horror and rage and fear and more rage, all competing for dominance while his mouth opened and closed without producing sound. You? He finally managed to speak as he took a threatening step toward me before Chastity grabbed his arm, though he shook her off violently. You demolished our house? I tilted my head slightly, as if considering the accuracy of his statement with genuine intellectual curiosity. Not our house, Michael. My house, my business asset, owned exclusively by my LLC and purchased 3 years before we even got married. I paused for effect. And technically I didn't demolish it myself. I contracted Westwood Demo and Excavation with Jack Morrison as foreman. Very professional crew who finished ahead of schedule actually. You can't do that. His face was completely red now with spittle flying. That's illegal. That's... I pulled out my phone with theatrical precision and opened the folder Lisa had meticulously prepared, showing screenshots of property deeds and purchase documents and the postnuptial agreement he'd signed 5 years ago without reading, because he was too busy scrolling through messages that were probably from Chastity even then. Actually, per Massachusetts property law and the terms of our postnuptial agreement, you remember signing that, right? You were so busy on your phone that day that Lisa had to ask you 3 times to actually pay attention. I can do whatever I want with my solely owned business assets, because the house was purchased by my LLC 3 years before we got married, and you never contributed to the mortgage or property taxes or insurance or renovations, which means legally, you had exactly 0 claim to it. I turned to Chastity for the first time and really looked at her, studying this woman who'd helped destroy my marriage. I'm sorry you're collateral damage in this situation, but that sounds like a you problem at this point. I paused. Still, congratulations on your wedding. The photos were absolutely beautiful, and I especially loved the one of my mother wearing lavender to your ceremony, because that really demonstrated the family's values perfectly. Chastity made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob, while her face crumpled. My mother stepped forward and drew herself up to full height, with her face twisted in rage and something else. Fear of losing control, fear of consequences, fear of being seen clearly for the first time in years. Monica Harmon, she said with her voice shaking from emotion she couldn't quite control. You will fix this right now because this is family property, and we helped with... Did you? I interrupted, with my voice dropping to something colder and sharper than I'd ever used with her before. Did you actually help? Because I have 12 years of receipts that say otherwise. Every renovation, every repair, every property tax payment, all mine and all documented and all paid from my business accounts. I took a step closer while she instinctively stepped back. You helped by what, exactly? Visiting for holidays and eating food I cooked? criticizing my career choices and telling me I worked too much, saying I wasn't feminine enough and didn't know how to keep a man happy. My voice was rising now despite my attempts at control. Was that your contribution to this property? My mother stepped back again as if I'd physically shoved her. I'm your mother! And you went to his wedding. I pointed at Chastity without looking at her, while he was still legally married to me, and you wore lavender, the same color you wore to my actual wedding, and you smiled for photos and you toasted their future, and you celebrated the end of my marriage like it was a family vacation. So let's not pretend family loyalty means anything coming from you at this point. The silence that followed was suffocating and oppressive, the kind of silence that precedes explosions or complete breakdowns. Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out weak and uncertain. Monica, come on, this is insane. You can't just... I already did, Marcus, I said with my voice going absolutely ice cold. And just so we're completely clear about the financial arrangements in this family, that college tuition I paid when Mom and Dad couldn't afford it was $48,000. The rent I covered for 6 months when you lost your job was $7,200, and the car loan I co-signed that you defaulted on and forced me to pay was $12,000. I paused. Should I continue itemizing, or do you get the picture? Marcus opened his mouth and closed it, and opened it again, but nothing emerged except a strangled sound. Consider it all repaid with interest in the form of this valuable life lesson. Don't betray the person who's been holding your life together, while you take everything for granted. June was crying now with mascara running in black streaks down her cheeks, and my father looked like he'd aged 10 years in the span of 10 minutes. Tom Brennan had wisely backed away during this confrontation, climbed into his truck, and driven off without saying another word. Then Chastity found her voice and screamed with her pretty face twisted into something ugly and raw. You're a bitch! You're a vindictive, cruel, pathetic. I'm an architect, I said calmly, cutting her off mid-insult. There's a substantial difference. I build things and I also unbuild them when necessary through controlled demolition, which is all about precision and timing and knowing exactly which structural supports to remove to make the whole edifice collapse, exactly where and when you want it to. Chastity lunged toward me with her hands reaching like claws, but Michael grabbed her arm and pulled her back roughly while shouting, Chastity, don't! How are we supposed to afford? She started before catching herself, but it was too late because the words were already out. I smiled with genuine satisfaction. Afford what, Chastity? I thought you came from serious money. Isn't your father Richard Hare worth millions? Doesn't he own all those luxury car dealerships across Massachusetts, the Ashford Auto Group with 17 locations? Her face flushed completely red. Or, I let the word hang in the air like smoke. Did you lie to him? I looked directly at Michael now. Did you tell her I had money that would be yours in a divorce? Tell her you owned half of everything? Tell her I was the cash cow you'd been milking for 12 years? Michael's expression shifted from rage to confusion. What is she talking about? Nothing, Chastity said quickly. Far too quickly to be convincing. She's just trying to... Or maybe, I continued with barely contained satisfaction, Chastity lied to you about her trust fund and her family's money and what she could offer you once you finally got rid of the wife who was funding your entire life. I let that accusation hang in the air between them, and the silence that followed was absolutely exquisite. The sound of two people realizing they'd been conning each other, while I'd been playing a completely different game with different rules and different stakes. Michael looked at Chastity with dawning horror. Chastity looked at the ground with guilt written across every feature. June looked between them like she was watching a tennis match, and my mother's mouth had formed a perfect O of shock. You deserve each other, I said simply. Michael's face had cycled through every possible emotion and landed on white-lipped fury. Where are we supposed to go, Monica? Where? I shrugged with exaggerated casualness. Maybe Chastity's place? Oh, wait. I looked at her with mock concern. You live with your parents, don't you? 28 years old and still in your childhood bedroom with posters on the walls? How romantic. I'm sure they'd love to host your new husband in the twin bed you've had since high school. Chastity made a strangled sound while tears started streaming down her face. I turned toward my car and then stopped, as if suddenly remembering something important. Oh, and Michael? I filed for divorce on Monday, and you'll be served at your office tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. sharp, when a process server will hand-deliver the papers in front of all your colleagues, including Chastity's replacement, whoever that turns out to be. I paused. My attorney is Lisa Smith, and you should probably look her up because she's never lost a case. Especially not against con artists. You can't do this, Michael shouted with desperation replacing anger. I'll sue you. I'll take you for everything. I pulled out my phone one last time, found the audio file I'd been saving for exactly this moment, and pressed play without warning. Michael's voice filled the street, tinny through my phone speaker but absolutely unmistakable in its casual cruelty. Don't worry, babe. Once I get the money from the house, we can leave sooner. She'll never know until it's too late. Chastity's response came next, light and carefree. You're terrible, but I love it. I love you. This time next year we'll be in our place in Miami. She'll still be working herself to death, and we'll be living our actual lives. I watched their faces while the recording played, and cataloged every reaction. June's shock with her mouth hanging open and eyes going wide. My father's confusion transforming into understanding, and then into something that looked disturbingly like shame. My mother's horror with her hand covering her mouth, Marcus's disgust, Chastity's panic, and Michael's absolute terror because he knew exactly what was coming next. I stopped the recording and let the silence settle like dust after a building collapse. He tried to forge my signature on a second mortgage application 6 months ago, I said quietly and calmly, letting each word land with maximum impact. Tried to steal equity from my house, the one owned exclusively by my LLC, to fund your new life together, which constitutes fraud under Massachusetts law. I looked directly at Chastity. That's criminal fraud, and I have evidence of all of it. The forged documents, the emails between you two planning how to access my money, all of it documented and photographed and backed up in multiple secure locations. Michael's legs seemed to give out beneath him, and he sat down hard on the curb with his head in his hands, like a puppet whose strings had been cut. Chastity stood frozen with her face cycling between red and white. So when you sue me, I looked at Michael again. Make absolutely sure your attorney knows about the attempted fraud first, because Lisa will be happy to add criminal charges to the divorce filing, and criminal convictions tend to affect asset division pretty significantly. Just for your information. I opened my car door and prepared to leave this scene behind forever. Wait! My father's voice was hoarse and desperate and broken in ways I'd never heard before. Monica, wait! I paused and looked at him, really looked at him for the first time in years. He looked old and tired and sad and broken in ways that had nothing to do with the demolished house, and when he spoke his voice carried the weight of decades of regret. I didn't know, he said quietly while looking at me with pleading eyes. About the text, about what Michael said, about any of it. Your mother told me they'd separated mutually, that it was amicable, that you'd agreed to everything. I agreed to nothing, I said with my voice flat and emotionless. But you knew that deep down, didn't you? You always know when Mom's lying to manipulate situations. You just choose not to see it because seeing it would require taking a stand. He didn't answer because he couldn't answer because we both knew it was true. I got in my car and started the engine, then rolled down the window one final time. Enjoy finding somewhere to sleep tonight, I said with pleasant cheerfulness that was more cutting than any anger could have been. I hear the Holiday Inn on Route 9 has vacancies. Tell them Monica Harmon sent you and maybe they'll give you a discount. I pulled away slowly and deliberately, giving myself time to watch them in the rearview mirror for as long as possible, committing this moment to memory. 7 people standing on an empty lot surrounded by luggage and shattered assumptions and the ruins of whatever they'd thought would be waiting for them, while the November sun cast long shadows across the pristine grass that covered the space where 12 years of my life used to stand. I drove 3 blocks before I had to pull over because my hands were shaking, not from fear or regret, but from pure undiluted adrenaline, from the satisfaction of watching them realize what they'd lost and what they'd thrown away, and what they'd catastrophically underestimated. I sat there for 10 minutes, breathing slowly and deliberately, letting the shaking subside and the adrenaline metabolize, and then I turned off my phone completely to avoid the inevitable flood of calls and texts and drove back to my new apartment in perfect silence. When I got home, I poured expensive wine. the kind Michael always said was wasteful and pretentious and unnecessary, and stood at my floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at city lights that glittered like broken promises scattered across the Boston skyline. I'd done it, had actually done it. Had demolished the house and executed the revenge and made them see and made them feel exactly what I'd felt when I saw that photo from Mexico. But I didn't feel triumphant or victorious. Just empty, like I'd torn down the house but couldn't figure out what to build in the empty space it left behind. Epilogue. 6 months later, I stood in front of the Harmon Heights development on a cool April morning, studying 8 luxury townhouses that had risen from the lot where my house used to stand, each unit a testament to my architectural vision and my ability to create something beautiful from complete destruction. My design had attracted significant attention. Architecture magazines had featured it prominently. Industry publications had interviewed me about the concept of building modern luxury on historic lots, and the project had won 2 regional awards for innovative urban residential design. I didn't tell them the full story behind the development, just the professional version, about honoring the past while creating something new for the future. My father and I had dinner once a month now at a small Italian restaurant in the North End, and he'd officially separated from my mother in January, moved into a modest apartment in Somerville with a view of the Charles River, and he seemed lighter somehow, like he'd been carrying impossible weight for decades, and had finally set it down. We didn't talk about June or Marcus, because that bridge was burned and would stay burned, but we talked about everything else. His dreams of traveling to places he'd always wanted to see, my plans to open a second office in Providence, the lives we were both building after our respective demolitions. On a Tuesday evening in late April, while I was reviewing blueprints for a new commercial project, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, and I almost didn't open it because unknown numbers rarely brought anything good. Unknown Monica, I've had time to think about everything that happened. We both made mistakes. Can we talk? I miss you. I miss us. What we had was real, even if it ended badly. Can we at least try to talk? Please, Michael. I stared at those words for exactly 3 seconds, while considering the photo he'd sent from Mexico, the caption that called me dead, the house he tried to steal, the 12 years I'd given him while he planned his exit with mathematical precision. I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who would have read that message and felt hope surging through her chest, who would have called him back immediately with trembling hands, who would have believed that we made mistakes meant something other than I want something from you now that my other plans have fallen apart. That woman was dead, demolished as thoroughly as the house she'd lived in. I typed with steady hands. Sorry, once it's old, it's dead to me. Funny how that works. Then I blocked the number and deleted the message and went back to my blueprints without another thought. I walked to my window and looked out at the Boston skyline that I'd helped shape, at buildings I'd designed that would stand for generations, at the city I'd claimed as mine through sheer force of will and professional competence. The demolition hadn't just been about destroying a house, it had been about destroying the version of myself who accepted betrayal, who made excuses for people who didn't deserve them, who built a life for others while neglecting to build one for herself. That woman was gone, and in her place was someone stronger and harder in some ways, more careful with trust and slower to forgive, but also more honest about what she wanted and more willing to walk away from what didn't serve her.